SAP, Mindshare, and Qualtrics have worked together on a study about mental health in the workplace that's going to come out on May 14th. But we're giving everybody here a quick preview of some of the interesting data and conversations that we've been able to engage with there. The study surveyed 1,500 different people in the United States and looked at a statistically significant sample of people representing all sorts of different demographics, as well as generational shifts from baby boomers to Gen Xers and everybody in between. And it's a very, I think, interesting and helpful thing that will add to our conversation. I think this will also help us dive into sort of the corporate and business perspective. Sometimes it's important that we've been able to look at what mental health is and how we talk about it. Some of the things we found in the survey help us to make this case and this conversation more on the business side, because as employers recognize how this impacts the bottom line, sometimes that's what it takes to push things over the edge, to make people want to invest more fully and recognize not only is it an important conversation for us to have just because it's important, but it's also going to impact how we are able to engage and retain our employees, how we're able to reduce turnover and increase productivity. So those are a few of the things that we'll chat through today. So let me start. We found that over 60% of survey respondents said that they'd experienced some sort of mental health condition within the past year. Now, that number probably isn't surprising to this audience. I think that'll be surprising to a lot of people. Kelly, give us your take on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So it is definitely not surprising to me now. However, 3 years ago, prior to starting Mindshare Partners, that number would have been shocking to me. And quite frankly, I wish that therapists were more in the practice of sharing that with their clients. I think knowing that data would have been extraordinarily helpful to me when I was really struggling at work. I was just really in isolation going to my therapist and having zero idea of the other types of people that were in therapy. And thank you for sharing that as well. I think it goes to show just how pervasive this is, and also, as we've been talking about today, how mental health is so much of a spectrum. That question was phrased in the survey around symptoms, and I think people are much more likely to acknowledge symptoms rather than necessarily acknowledging to themselves that they have a full mental health condition, and they may not, but people go back and forth in time, and I think that's just so important to note that it's just very much part of the human experience.
Yeah. Nick, as you look at that number and the prevalence, what are your thoughts in terms of how we need to look at that differently as corporations? I know you've just said that so much of it is how we have to respond, but what do corporations need to do to create an environment knowing that it's so pervasive?
I think they have to make it a badge of honor to be honest about it. If you think about SAP as an example, our CEO, Bill McDermott, had a freak accident a couple years ago. He fell downstairs and smashed his face into a glass and lost his left eye. And he has been remarkable in terms of how open he was about the emotional trauma that caused, staring in the face that he might not be able to come back and be CEO, which is a job he had dreamt about his whole life. So I think, Mike, the 60% number tells me that there are people out there who are brave and who are honest. I think you're going to see that number go up even more the more we do our jobs about showing our own vulnerability in the same way that Bill did.
One of the most interesting things I think that came out in the study is that it showed that there was no difference at different levels of an organization between the prevalence of mental health. And so those at the C-level or entry level both said, hey, we experienced this at the same rate. Were you guys surprised by that? And what does that mean to us about making it a safe place to talk about?
Yeah, I was surprised, to be honest with you, because I had sort of envisioned that people who were higher up were going to be more cautious about this in general. I think that people coming up in their career at a mid-career level oftentimes are more honest. I don't want to cast aspersions on C-suite executives, but not necessarily a reputation for being particularly genuine.
He's referring to other ones.
Yeah, exactly. It is what it is, right? So I think that the fact that the numbers were in line is a positive. I think frankly, we're going to need those people at the higher levels to admit it and to be open about it if we're going to make it easy and comfortable for people who are coming up in their careers to also admit it as well.
I think for me, what struck me there was just the fact that there really is no difference. Humans are humans. And I think, unfortunately, so many of us buy into this myth that it's the low performers that have mental health conditions. Or if you have a mental health condition, you're never going to make it to the top. And that's just not true. I think we've seen, this morning in the Leaders Go First panel, extremely successful, highly capable people dealing with the same challenges as everyone else. And I think as a lot of times, sometimes people framed them, as a superpower in some respects, and flipping that on its head and thinking about it as a benefit. So I really do, appreciate that data came back, with authentic results to your point around that self-awareness. But I think that just goes to show that, it's high performers too, and often disproportionately so. That's just not represented in the media.
So one area of this is obviously we can say it's important to talk about it, it's important to tell people, but there is a big stigma. I wonder if the stigma, never seems to go away. So besides just talking about it, what can leaders do? Is this a grassroots movement? Is it a leadership movement? I imagine it's obviously got to be a bit of both. What is your advice to different leaders in organizations and people at the front lines of organizations to help talk about this, to reduce the stigma, since it is so pervasive?
Okay, I would say it's hurting, to any business leader, I would say it's hurting your business results whether you want to admit it or not. People are experiencing this. The statistics prove it out. Being proactive in confronting it and giving people a platform to admit it and confront it themselves will only help business. I mean, it's a lot like diversity and inclusion in some ways. I mean, some of the mistakes that we made coming up when we were trying to really get diversity and inclusion on the radar screen is that we would talk about it as a virtue and not as a business benefit. And it is both. Companies that are inclusive outperform companies that aren't, and in the same way, teams where there is an environment where people feel comfortable being who they are and admitting what's going on in their own mind will outperform teams where that's not possible.
Yeah, I think in terms of the stigma and getting past that and just what everyone can do, there is a role for everyone. And I think ultimately, in the C-suite, particularly CEOs, they're the culture setters of the organization. And so I think, we saw this morning, every single person stood up when they said, Jen asked, does someone have a close family member or friend that has a mental health challenge? So everybody can be an ally. And so really starting from the C-suite in terms of, people showing up saying it's okay to have this conversation at this company. It's okay to put your therapy appointment publicly on your calendar. No problem, we'll make it happen. Get your work done, take care of yourself. There's lots of ways for leaders to be allies. What I would stress hugely is the importance of having those ally stories and personal stories be hopeful. When I had to take that leave of absence, my manager, who was very well-meaning, told me a story about her mom who had anxiety, and I think she was trying to, relate to me and empathize. And it was framed in, my mom just never got better. She couldn't have a high-stress job, and that was not acceptable to me. I was going to be a high performer, and I was going to get past this. And so just being really careful as you're sharing those stories is really important. And I think in terms of, the employee resource groups, we'll hear a little bit more about that later today. That's something that can absolutely be a grassroots initiative in terms of, bringing those to bear. And then trainings, getting managers in particular trained on how to name, normalize, and navigate, as we say at Mindshare Partners, and really giving them those skills to navigate the conversation. There's a lot that managers can do without, having to run to HR that's really in their wheelhouse.
One more point I'd make on that, Mike. I think all companies, large, small, have sort of an emotional character that's embedded in the culture. It's a little bit of SAP as an example. Mike and I know that next week is our largest customer-facing event of the year. And for SAP, the 2 weeks before are the absolute worst 2 weeks of the year. Everybody hits a wall. Everybody's stressed, everybody's scared, everybody's frustrated, everybody's overworked. And I think leaders have a responsibility to understand sort of the fluidity of that calendar and to stay ahead of it. because there's nothing worse that when you're having a low or a high, frankly, to be doing it in a vacuum where you feel like the rest of the environment around you at work is on a completely different page. So I think that leaders can do a lot to admit, sort of where the highs and the lows are likely to be, so that we can, help people adjust to that in a more natural way.
All the more impressive, by the way, that Nick is here with us today in the midst of the busiest moment of his year. You hit on a point a minute ago that I think is really important. We talked about how diversity and inclusion used to just be a, hey, we should do this, and everyone also recognizes now how important it is to a business as well. We just had a panel talking about diversity and inclusion. Kelly, talk to us a little bit about how mental health should fit into that conversation and why it's particularly important in that conversation, especially with the results we found in the study.
Absolutely. So we are really seeing that mental health is the next frontier of diversity and inclusion. As we heard in that panel, what I think is incredibly exciting is the companies that are pretty far along in their diversity and inclusion journeys really are looking at disability and mental health as a subset within that as the next step that they want to take. And what I found particularly to be interesting about thinking of mental health as diversity and inclusion is it's somewhat the opposite of how we normally think about diversity and inclusion. Typically, when you think about D&I, it's actively trying to recruit folks into your organizations to, add to the diversity around the table. Obviously there's lots of studies that show how that improves your innovation and your bottom line. With mental health, it's actually the flip of that. It's really thinking about, these people exist at your organization. You just don't know who they are. And so really wanting to create that inclusive environment, and by the same token, making the most of the folks that you have on your team, improving productivity, improving employee engagement. There's a host of data, that shows, as Nick and others have talked to, in terms of the business benefits of paying attention to that. So I think that's something that's increasingly coming to bear. And as we spoke about earlier this morning in the diversity and inclusion panel, it is an extra challenge on the other side of that for underrepresented folks within communities. I mean, I personally can only speak to my identity as a woman in the workplace, but certainly, when I was in management consulting and was definitely in the minority being a woman, that's an extra hurdle, to have to deal with that on top. So getting at the intersectionality of that and all the implications, it's a lot of extra burden for folks.
The only thing I'd add is that we have to be extraordinarily careful, I think. We have a program called Autism at Work. A lot of companies have started them, where we're bringing people, women and men who are on the autism spectrum, into the workforce and giving them opportunities that align perfectly to the skills that they have. We don't want them to be our autistic colleagues. We just want them to be our colleagues. And in this context, we don't want it to be like, oh, that's the mental health table in the cafeteria, It's like, this is true inclusion, then it has to be possible for people to be who they are and to fit into a very diverse patchwork quilt of an employee base without necessarily feeling like they're different or they're part of the special group. Like, we want inclusion.
Yeah. I'm 36 years old and single and Mormon, and in the Mormon community, if you're 36 and single, you might as well be 95 and single. And so for a long time, I had to coach my mother that I didn't want to be her single child. I just wanted to be one of her children. I think it's it's a similar thing in its own way. Anyway, let's talk briefly about this idea. Sorry.
Let's talk more about your love life, actually. Yeah.
Is this what I'm supposed to say, exit stage right?
Seriously, this is where we're not talking about my love life. No, but I want to read some stats here. I think it's pretty interesting. We found that 20% of respondents had voluntarily left roles for mental health reasons. That number jumps to 50% of millennials and 75% for Gen Z. So we're seeing in this study this trend that was clear throughout everything, that the issues of mental health are growing pretty substantially with each generation. Would love to understand how both of you respond to that stat, especially in terms of what it means for business performance and employee turnover, and why the difference in generations is notable.
Sure. So I think, first of all, that's incredibly exciting. To me, that means that culture change is coming. Mindshare partners exist to speed that along, but we have absolutely seen anecdotally, and I'm so glad that's backed up in our survey as well, that millennials and Gen Z are really demanding this of their workplaces. They don't understand why they can be having these conversations in college, where increasingly there's lots of mental health clubs. Some of these folks have been in therapy or on medicine since their teenage years, and all of a sudden they hit work and they're not allowed to have these conversations anymore, and HR cautions them about, talking publicly about mental health. And I think what's interesting too is that in companies that are really competing for talent, they're really having to respond to that millennial and Gen Z demand of not only really wanting solid mental health benefits at their company, but wanting that level of transparency. Just as other folks earlier today were talking about how it's fine, at least in San Francisco, to roll into a company and be very open about your LGBTQ status. Similarly, a lot of these millennials and Gen Z people want to just be as open about their mental health status. And so to me, that's incredibly exciting, and I think really signifies that culture change that's already underway. We just need to wait for those folks to be in leadership positions, and we're trying to do our best to speed that along at Mindshare Partners.
So I agree with Kelly, and I'm normally torn on this question because, young people in the workforce is a tricky thing. I mean, we were all young at some point, some of us longer ago than others. Going into the workforce and starting your career journey on the way up, you're not supposed to be in charge right away. And you're not supposed to necessarily get your way right away. You're supposed to put in the time. You're supposed to work hard. You're supposed to learn. I think in that context, people are too impatient early in their career right now. Where I think they are entitled to be impatient and where I hope that they will be is exactly in this area. And I think by being more selective and strategic in how they use their power as change agents, one area being in this area, then it's not something that's easy for their management teams and their hires up, who are perhaps later in their career, to resent them purely on the basis of implying that they know the right way and everybody else is the wrong way. So I think this is one area where it's really good to accelerate that, and I think they're great change agents for it.
One interesting stat that just goes to basic social psychology, we found that 2/3 of respondents said that they would be happy to comfort or be part of a support group for a colleague that had a mental health condition, but only 1/3 of respondents said that they would be willing to reach out for help. It shows people want to be helpful, but are unwilling to sort of ask for that. Why do you think that is, and how do you set up a culture that solves for that?
There's a website now you can go to for men who want to get a prescription for Viagra, where you don't actually have to go into a doctor's office and admit you have the problem. It's pretty stunning. I mean, the amount of work we'll go to in society to make it easy to handle that particular issue. I think we still have a problem in the workplace where it feels a lot like you're raising your hand and saying, I can't handle my job. And, again, the fact that people would associate being part of the solution as a good thing, but admitting the problem a bad thing, tells us that we still have work to do, which is why I think to your earlier question around people later in their career, people who've moved up the ladder, showing the vulnerability, showing that it's okay. I mean, we have 2,000 colleagues in our marketing communications organization. I wouldn't hesitate 1 minute to say, I've got serious issues on my down days trying to figure out what the trigger was. I have no problem with that. It happens a lot. I'm trying to get control of it, and something I'm open about with my own therapist. So somehow we have got to convince people it is not a career-ending proposition to be vulnerable and to show that you have a challenge that you're trying to confront.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And to your point about those websites, some of them actually offer anxiety medication as well. So
Perfect.
That's also flying under the radar. I think that it just goes to show you there is so much stigma left in the workplace, and that people just aren't empowered to, really come forward with their own struggles. For me, in founding Mindshare Partners, it was because I felt like I was at a place in my career where I'd checked enough resume boxes, quite frankly, and was in a dual income household that I felt comfortable taking this risk. And most people are not in that position. And so I think we really just need to empower people to be okay doing this. And I think that comes from the top in terms of, having C-level folks, particularly CEOs, speaking out about this issue, normalizing it. and in turn, showing that it's not going to be career limiting to start talking about this.
I mean, it's like anything else at work. We're going to finish up today, and then I'm going to go back to the crazy few days I have, and I'm going to call Vivek 12 times and Jen and say, "What do you think I could have done better? How should this have gone?" I mean, we don't mind asking for feedback. We don't mind asking people to coach us on how to be better if we think that will be seen as the sign of somebody who is conscious of wanting to do a better job. So somehow, we've got to just make the one additional crosswalk to say, it's the exact same thing to say, you got something going on that's impeding your ability to be your full self, to meet your full potential. It just may happen to be a mental health issue. And if you can ask somebody, for advice on how to do a better presentation, you can ask somebody for advice on how to be a little bit more self-aware, a little bit more whatever you need in order to get over that hurdle. And it's the same thing. You simply want to be better and live up to your full potential, and that's how I think we should contextualize it.
So I've just got another question or two, and then we're going to turn it to all of you. So if you want to be thinking of questions that you have. This was a particularly striking stat, not necessarily surprising, unfortunately. But about half of respondents said that they had negative experiences talking about mental health at work. They were very hesitant to go talk to their HR personnel or to even their own managers, and when they did go talk to them, they said it was a negative experience. Tell us, Kelly, obviously you've had some personal experience that you've talked a lot about. What's your advice to organizations, and how do you change that? Because once you finally have the courage to go do it and then it's really a terrible experience, no one's going to keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great point, and one that I alluded to earlier in terms of do not be my manager. As well-intentioned as that person was, any sort of allyship or personal story sharing should really be hopeful. If it's not, don't say it. The people that are coming to you, it takes so much courage to do that, especially if you're not in a position of power at work. Really just trying to make that as human and as easy as possible on the other side. It's okay to say, thank you so much for sharing. Take a minute, just soak that in, and or even say, thank you so much for sharing. I need some time to think about that. Can we put a meeting on the calendar for tomorrow? I really appreciate you sharing that with me. It's okay not to have the answers, but just try to be graceful about it and less gawky, as Meredith was saying this morning in that particular instance, when you are in charge as a leader. So I think that goes a long way. It also goes a long way to really equip your managers to have those tools, as we were talking about. Certainly at times it is appropriate to involve HR, but there are a lot of very easy things that managers can do that don't require going to HR. So just making sure that people know what those are, and we'll be talking about those later today in our workshop. But yeah, I think just really giving people the empathy and support and positivity, and sort of also just recognition that was a brave thing to do and that you appreciate them sharing.
I think there's another piece of that, and I think that's beautifully said, Kelly. I fully agree. We have a new frontier for what it means to be HR. I know there's a lot of people in HR who are here. The rest of the company has to think about HR differently in order to allow HR professionals to free themselves from the paperwork burden of constantly writing position descriptions and nonsense, which don't actually move the needle for the people who actually work in these companies, and free them up to be trusted resources for people so that they can serve that role without necessarily needing to, be overburdened by the administrative workload that exists. That is a battle that has to be waged from within HR, defining what the role needs to be as this continues to become even bigger and more significant as an issue. But it also has to come from outside HR, where the rest of us have to sit back and say, what do I want the people in our company who are focused on our people to actually be doing with their time? And increasingly, it should be talking to and helping the people who work here, and not necessarily doing some of the other stuff that we continue to insist that we get out of HR, which doesn't really add a lot of value.
Yeah, I love what you both said there. I think at least at Qualtrics, a major push that all of us have is that it's not about always going to HR, but managers have to be equipped to have these conversations. That's who's working with everybody on the day-to-day, and it has to be a much more safe place for them to go there. We've got about 5 minutes left. Would love to turn to you for any of your questions about this study or for just these two experts up here. It'll be released on Tuesday, May 14th, and it will be released in the media that day, but I am sure that Mindshare has a way to get it to all of you in its full as well. Is that fair?
That is absolutely fair. I think all of you will probably be inherently added to our newsletter by virtue of being here today. You can certainly opt out if that is not of interest, but that will absolutely be visible there.
I do think it gives a good opportunity. I'm not always a huge fan of social media, but I think when we have good material where you can use it as a tool to broaden the reach of the conversation, I think that's something we should all take the opportunity to do.
Okay, well, if there are no more questions, let me just thank Nick and Kelly for their time and for this excellent panel and for being here.